dietary foods that are associated with the Alzheimer's include, guess what? High sugar diets, high glycemic diets, high salt diets,
Oh, man.
the exact same ones that either produce or that generate fructose. The same ones, okay? It's associated with obesity and diabetes, which are conditions which we know are being driven by fructose.
Welcome to the Invigor Medical Podcast, where we sit down with medical professionals and discuss a full spectrum of health-related subjects. It all starts in 3, 2, 1.
Hello and welcome to the Invigor Medical Podcast. I'm Natalie Garland here with my cohort, Derek. Thanks for being here today. Today we have with us Dr. Richard Johnson, MD. Dr. Richard Johnson is an internationally acclaimed scientist for more than 20 years. He has led research on the cause of obesity and diabetes. His research has been highly cited and published in top medical journals, and he is the author of The Sugar Fix, The Fat Switch, and his latest book, Nature Wants You to Be Fat. I am really curious to talk about that one because it's kind of like a trigger title you got going there. But before we jump into that, I would just love to know a little bit about how you got here. But first of all, thanks for being with us this evening.
Well, thank you so much. It's a delight being on your show. And so I'm a physician. I actually trained as a kidney specialist and an infectious disease specialist. So you could say, well, how the heck did you end up studying obesity?
Right.
Diabetes when you're actually, started off my research studying kidney disease. And it's a long circuitous thing, but basically I followed my nose and followed where my research took me. So we started looking at diet, and a lot of people focus on alcohol and beer, and alcohol such as beer as a cause of gout and raising your uric acid level, or red meats. But another thing that can drive up uric acid is sugar, and there's a component of sugar called fructose, and high fructose corn syrup is a common added sugar.
Hidden in a lot of things, isn't it?
It sure is. So I started studying fructose to see if that could have a role in high blood pressure, and if whether or not it could involve uric acid, because fructose generates uric acid when you eat it. And to my dismay, we found that when we lowered uric acid in animals, that fructose we could prevent the rise in blood pressure that occurs with fructose. But the big dismay was that it also seemed to block the development of obesity and diabetes, at least partially. And so then we started realizing that fructose had a big role in causing obesity and diabetes. And we started studying it. We realized that the uric acid was really important. And what was interesting is uric acid is not part of the calories of fructose. It's generated as a kind of a side reaction. So it doesn't have to do anything with the calories you get from fructose. And so at that time, it was around 2005 or so, there was this belief that the reason you got fat was because it was always calories. And we realized that that here was a non-caloric mechanism driving obesity. And so we started getting really interested in what it was about fructose that made it so unique. And then we started studying sugar. And then before long, we realized that the body can make fructose from other foods besides sugar. So it wasn't just sugar. And so it's been a long story, but basically I keep following where the research takes me. And I, in fact, I also follow where my emails come from. And so I'm delighted to be here to talk to you because it's the same principle.
So, Dr. Johnson, you spelled out a lot there that I kind of want to unpack for our audience that's watching. You covered a lot of things in that explanation of how you've gotten to where you are today. So, a couple of things I kind of want to ask about are, what is uric acid exactly? And you kind of touched a little bit on like why it's so bad, but how does it come about? What is it? And what are some of the specific health effects that it has on the body?
Yeah, thanks, Derek. So uric acid is a substance that circulates in our blood, and everybody has some amount of uric acid in their blood. It's actually a breakdown product from nucleic acids. So usually we think of our bodies as made up of protein and fat and carbohydrate, water, but there's these things called nucleic acids which make up our DNA, our RNA. The energy we make is ATP. Those are basically related to nucleic acids. And when those things break down, they produce uric acid as their byproduct. And uric acid is then excreted. And, all animals have to excrete some uric acid, it seems. And we have to excrete some as well. And so this uric acid is considered a byproduct, and it circulates in our blood, and it can build up. And when you're eating a lot of sugar or, for example, alcohol, you can raise your uric acid levels significantly. And if the uric acid levels get up too high, it's famous for causing a disease, gout. And gout is this disease in which you get arthritis of classically your big toe, and but it can be in your knees, your ankles, your wrists, and it's really painful. And it affects about 9 million people in the United States, and it's due to these high uric acid that gets so high that it starts to form crystals in the joints. But it can also form crystals elsewhere. And in the last few years, we discovered, and others have discovered, that uric acid can crystallize in the kidney, it can crystallize in the skin. It forms a thing called tophi. But more scary is the fact that it can crystallize and deposit in the blood vessels. Mm-hmm. And it's been found in the coronary arteries and in the aorta. And it seems to predispose, it tends to crystallize in plaques. And so, these atherosclerotic plaques that predispose to heart attacks. And so there's this renewed, very significant interest that gout is strongly associated with heart disease and with heart attacks and sudden cardiac death. And there's a lot of thought that it may be that the crystals from uric acid may be depositing in these blood vessels and be playing a role in causing heart disease. There's a lot of evidence for it.
Dr. Johnson, just to clarify something, I just wanted to clarify at the beginning, you're saying that essentially the uric acid is a natural byproduct of cellular respiration. That's a tongue twister. Would you say that that's correct? So glucose enters into like the mitochondria, produces ATP, and then one of the byproducts of that whole process is uric acid.
Yeah. So uric acid is a breakdown of DNA, RNA, and ATP. And in fructose, it's coming from the ATP or the energy. So when ATP is expended or when it's spent, ATP gets broken down to AMP, I guess, and ADP. And these things can break down and eventually they can produce uric acid. So uric acid was always viewed as a waste product. It was viewed as a waste product. And it was viewed as a nuisance because if the concentrations built up, it would form crystals. And those crystals could cause gout and possibly kidney disease. Now we know heart disease. And so this kind of views uric acid as just, a waste product that can form crystals. What our work did as well, and now it's been confirmed by so many groups, is that uric acid is a biologically active molecule. And it actually stimulates inflammation, and it stimulates a number of things. And one of the big things it does is that it causes damage to the mitochondria. It temporarily shuts down mitochondria. Mitochondria are the energy factories. And so what it does is when it builds up inside the cell, it actually can reduce the amount of energy produced in a cell. So it reduces the ATP production. And this turns out to be the trick for how fructose tends to cause weight gain. And, I don't know. I'd love to explain this.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes,
Go ahead.
please.
Okay, so classically, everyone has thought that weight gain is supposed to be because you eat too much food, which gives you energy. And if you eat more than you use, in other words, more than you expend, that excess energy is turned into fat. And so it's supposed to be a simple equation. If I eat too much food, more than I need and more than I spend, more than I use, that excess energy gets stored as fat. And it's called the energy balance equation. It's actually a law of physics. It's called the law of thermodynamics. And basically, it's true. If you eat more than you spend, you will gain energy, and that can be stored as fat. Now, here's where the problem was. The problem was that the way people have always viewed it is that you have two forms of energy in your body. You have the active energy we're using, which is the ATP, and then you have the stored energy, which is like fat, and a little bit is glycogen or starch in a plant. But that's the stored carbohydrate. But most of the energy we store is fat. And the great thing about fat is it can be broken down to generate the energy you need. So like a hibernating bear, for example, will get really fat. And then when it's hibernating, it's not getting any energy from eating because it's hibernating, but it breaks down the fat to provide the energy it needs. So there's two forms of energy: stored energy, fat, and active energy, ATP. And the theory has always been that you have to fill up the ATP. It's like filling up the gas tank. And when the ATP is filled up and you've got it all, then the extra energy gets turned into fat. And that was the thinking. The actuality of how it works, though, is to gain weight. What we tend to do is what we want to do is to drop the ATP levels in the cell so that we go into a low energy state when you just look at the ATP. And what happens is when the ATP falls, it's like an alarm signal. I don't have enough energy. I need to eat food. I need to forage and find food. I'm hungry. I need to store fat because my energy levels are low. But actually, it's only the ATP levels that are low, because at the same time, the fructose blocks the ability of the fat to break down to restore the ATP. Because normally, if ATP went down, then the fat would break down to provide the ATP you need to fill the tank. So what happens is when you eat fructose, it stuns the mitochondria so that they don't make as much energy or ATP. So the ATP levels fall, but at the same time, it blocks the stored fat, the fat, from breaking down to replace the ATP. So now you're hungry, you're eating more food, but the food, instead of going to make ATP, is relatively shunted to the stored fat. So the energy balance is maintained. It is still the energy you take in equals what you spend plus what's the active and stored energy. But instead, the energy is going to the stored energy, the fat, and so the fat gets bigger, and eventually the ATP levels come up, and then you're fine, but at the expense that you've eaten more, and now you have more fat. Did I explain that okay, or do I need to do it again?
I mean, it sounds like a pretty complicated process, honestly. And, I'm very intrigued by this because, being into health and fitness and nutrition for a lot of years, you get a lot of information about how do you actually lose weight. And some people, hammer home really hard, like, well, you just have to be in a calorie deficit. That's it. It doesn't matter what you eat. As long as you take in fewer calories than you expend, you're going to lose weight. What I'm hearing in you describing this is that eating fructose and the way it interacts with the ATP, it means that you're not actually burning that stored fat like you want to be doing in order to lose weight because of what's happening with the ATP, which, by the way, what is ATP? I don't even know what that is.
So ATP is the currency we use it's the active form of energy that the body uses. And it's actually a substance that can donate phosphate groups. But basically what it does is it represents the active energy. And think of it as like money. It's the active energy. It's what we have what we use to spend to do things and to do whatever we want. It's the energy. And what I'm just saying is that in our body, we have active energy, which is the energy we're using, and we have stored energy. And everybody was thinking that we always keep the active energy maxed out, and then the extra energy goes into fat. But what happens is the fructose trick, I call it the fructose trick, because it's the only nutrient that does it. It drops the active energy in the cell purposely, reduces it to make you feel like you're in an energy deficit, like you need to eat more. And then when you eat, instead of going to replace the ATP, it goes into the stored fat. And so the stored fat gets bigger while the ATP levels still stay low. So energy balance is still there. What you eat gets put into energy, but it's not going into your active energy. It's going into the stored energy. And so you keep eating until that active energy finally fills up. And when that does, the problem is you've eaten more than you need, so that your stored fat has expanded. So it's a brilliant system to basically what it does is it tricks you into thinking you're starving. And so it drops the energy in your cell, makes you think you're starving, so you eat more. And then eventually you bring your ATP levels up, but at the expense of a higher stored fat.
So, Dr. Johnson, this mechanism that you're talking about where your body essentially tricks yourself into thinking that you don't have enough energy, I'm guessing this is what you talk about in your book, Nature Wants You to Be Fat, in that our bodies are biologically set up to like be predisposed to store this energy because it's always wanted to be in essentially a survival mode. In fact, you talk about this survival mode in your book. Can you dive in a little bit deeper on what you mean by that, by like that mechanism of like survival instinct or that survival mode that you talk about?
Yeah. So this low energy state activates a survival response, and it's evolutionary based. So, so basically think of it this way. If you're an animal and you suddenly do not have any food around, you're going to start starving. And there's all these biologic responses that occur when you're starving. Or let's say you don't have enough water around, you'll get dehydrated. But these are like life-threatening situations. When you don't have any food around, it's like really dangerous that you're going to die. And same thing with water. And animals have evolved to develop a way to protect themselves before they get into trouble. And so when they know or they sense that there's going to be a time when there's no food around, they will activate this switch when there's still food around to help them store fat so that they're ready when winter comes. And what we see this is, for example, in animals that hibernate, like the bear. So the bear will hibernate in the winter, in which it will sleep with a reduced metabolism, but it's basically sleeping and not eating at all for 3 or 4 months. It will just not eat at all. So it has to have sufficient fat or it will die, because it needs to have that fat. And in fact, bears can be pregnant when they hibernate. And so they have to be they have to have enough fat to help, the fetus grow while it's hibernating. So the bear does this, several months before it hibernates. It will change its behavior. So during the summer, it stays at a relatively lean weight. Spring and summer, it's in a lean weight. If it eats extra food, it just burns it off. It regulates. It actually keeps its weight normal. If you starved it, it would take and quit starving. It would go right back to its normal weight. If you overfed it, it will come back to its normal weight. It stays at the weight it's supposed to be. But when it knows that winter is coming, or when nature senses that,
gives it the indications. The days are getting shorter, nights are getting longer. Yeah.
Yes, and we can talk about what those signals are. But the bear will start getting hungrier and start eating more, and will start storing a lot of fat. Now, the mechanism for that wasn't well understood, but our group identified fructose as a major mechanism. So fructose is, again, it's the sugar that's in table sugar. So table sugar has both glucose and fructose. It's also in high fructose corn syrup, but fructose is also in things like fruit, which we think of as healthy. And fruit is healthy. So, but before we go into that, if you eat a ton of fruit, you get a lot of fructose. And bears will eat thousands of grapes at a time. And the grapes contain this sugar, fructose, and they get a big slug of fructose, and it activates this switch by dropping the ATP in the cell. So it lowers the energy in the cell, and that stimulates hunger and thirst and foraging. And now when they eat, they won't, their appetite's not controlled. It's called an impairment of satiety. Satiety is that sense of fullness.
I feel like I deal with that on a regular basis.
Yeah.
Of satiety.
I feel like that happens to me every night at midnight.
Just call me a bear, Derek. Just call me a bear.
I agree. It means you just stay hungry, right? You eat and you don't feel full. And, I have that same problem at times. And so it turns out that is, it gets triggered in the bear. The bear keeps eating. It will gain 10 pounds a day. It will start building up its fat stores. It will actually make fat, and it will block the burning of fat.
Wow.
So the fat's going in there, but it's not going to burn it. It induces a thing called insulin resistance. And, as you probably know, insulin resistance we think of it as a bad thing because it progresses to diabetes. And everyone's kind of worried about becoming insulin resistant because it's kind of the first step towards becoming diabetic. And what happens in insulin resistance is your blood glucose levels go up. And that's because there's an impairment. There's the word impairment again.
Lots of impairing going on here. We're struggling with a lot of things here.
So there's this impairment in the ability of glucose to get into the muscle. So normally the muscle uses glucose as a fuel, but when you become insulin resistant, insulin's a hormone that helps move glucose into the muscle, and the muscle becomes resistant to the effects of insulin. That's why it's called insulin resistance. And so the glucose builds up in the blood, and that's actually a survival tactic because there's regions of the brain that do not require insulin. And this provides some glucose to the brain if there's like limited fuel. And if you're in a starvation or an alarm mode, you want to preserve what glucose you have so that it goes to the brain where you can think as opposed to the muscles, because everyone knows that you may be able to run, but if you can't think, you're pretty much dead.
Right.
Abort the fetal position. This is not working for us.
Exactly. So anyway, it turns out, and blood pressure goes up, and there's like a ton of things that go on that's associated with this activation of the switch. And bears do it by eating a ton of fruit. Okay. Now humans, we eat fruit, but we're eating like 2 or 3 fruit at a time. And we're not getting fruit, this huge bolus of fructose from the fruit. Okay. So we're getting just small amounts. And I've actually done clinical trials, and natural fruits are unlikely to activate this switch unless you eat a ton of them.
Okay. That's good to know, because I think we all like our fruit, right? And you want to feel like you're getting something fresh and healthy. And there's only so many leafy greens you can eat in a day, Dr. Johnson, exactly. I feel like.
Exactly. And fruits actually are a great way if you're craving for something sweet. They're a great thing to eat because they have a lot of good stuff like vitamin C and epicatechin and flavonols. And we've actually shown that some of those things actually neutralize the fructose. So as the fruit ripens, for example, vitamin C content in the fruit goes down, so that typically a ripe fruit has very little vitamin C, whereas a tart fruit and we often like tart fruits, they tend to be high in vitamin C and lower in sugar or fructose. And so we tend to eat fruit when it's not as likely to activate the switch. And also it's really the concentration of fructose that activates the switch. So 1 or 2 fruit doesn't give you that much fructose, and you're eating it with fiber, so it slows the absorption. So if you're eating, if it turns out, like if you soft drinks, which contain sugar, contain huge amounts of fructose. So here's the first little rule. If you drink a soft drink, you're basically activating this whole process that makes you want to store fat. But if you sipped it, and it's impossible to do for a lot of people, but if you just sipped it over a couple hours, it would probably be more like a calorie, because you wouldn't get that activation of the switch because the fructose concentrations would be low because you're just taking a small amount at a time. Or here's another thing. If you drink the fructose the soft drink in the middle of the afternoon with no other food, it's going to really activate the switch. But if you were drinking it in the middle of a meal where there's a lot of other food in the stomach and in the intestines that can slow the absorption, it will be less likely to activate the switch, or will activate it to a lesser extent. So there's these tricks you can learn once you kind of understand how it works. And one of the other big thing to just mention quickly is that we discovered that, unfortunately, this is really unfortunate, the fructose doesn't just come from sugar, but you can make fructose, and we make it from glucose.
Inside our own bodies.
Yes, the bodies can make
Such
it.
Good news. Go on.
It's been proven in people. It can be very significant. And the main thing that drives it are the high glycemic carbs. So things like the things we love: bread, hot bread with a little butter, not the butter so much, but the bread does. French fries, they don't have any sugar in them, but they have starch, and the starch breaks down the glucose, and salt also stimulates the production of fructose.
Really?
So it turns out that glucose is the substance that's turned into fructose. So you got to have glucose around. So you have to, like potatoes and rice and cereal, they give you that glucose. But then the conversion of glucose to fructose is sped up by salt. So if you're eating a lot of salt, you can convert the carbs into fructose more easily. So that's why French fries are really bad, because the potato carries the glucose, and the salt on the French fries, which makes it taste so good.
Oh man, you're killing me, Dr. Johnson.
Yeah,
I'm just sitting here thinking about my favorite, the kettle cooked salt and vinegar potato chips.
Those things are so good.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, they are.
I can't stop.
They're really good. And the sour cream potato chips, they really taste good. And it's unfortunately because it's the carbs and the salt. And so some studies suggest that potato chips and French fries are the most likely foods to make you overweight. So there is a trick, though. I can tell you one trick. And the way that the salt activates the enzymes that convert glucose to fructose is driven by raising the salt concentration in your blood. But if you drink water and block that, you can block the conversion. And so, or at least reduce it. So if you drank a lot of water so that you don't feel thirsty from those potato chips, you can keep the salt concentration down, and then it still will be generating some fructose, but it's not anywhere near like what it was.
So I always thought, whenever I heard someone say, hey, if you want to lose weight, drink lots of water, I always thought, and it's like, oh, I don't know how much I believe that. But it sounds like there's actual biomechanical mechanism behind it that's like, hey, if you drink water, it'll reduce the amount of salt, and it'll help reduce this conversion of glucose to fructose. So that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, there's a whole story behind that. So it turns out that fat is, when you burn fat, you make energy. And everyone knows that. You burn fat. That's how the bear survives. That's how the bird that migrates 10,000 miles survives. They burn the fat to make the energy they need, since they don't have any food they're eating. But it turns out that when you burn fat, you also produce water. So fat doesn't contain water, but you can make water from fat. And it turns out that animals are well aware of this. And there's all of these animals that live that make fat to provide water. Like the whale. The whale doesn't drink seawater. It gets fresh water from the food it eats, but about a third of the water it gets comes from the fat. So although the whale has a lot of fat, so it can dive deep in the cold water, the fat has another purpose. It provides water to them when they burn it.
Never knew
And
that.
like camels have a hump on their back that is filled with fat, and they use that fat to produce water when they get really dehydrated. So it turns out that when you're really dehydrated, the fat gets turned into water. But if you just get mildly dehydrated, like by eating salt or just very mild dehydration, that also will stimulate the production of fat. And it does it by stimulating fructose production. So it stimulates fructose production, and then if you have glucose around, the glucose gets converted to fructose. And so the way it does is the salt or the dehydration activates the enzyme that converts the glucose to fructose. So that's how it works.
Well, I'm glad you kind of started talking a little bit about how the switch happens in us as humans. And, because you're talking about bears and eating all this fruit. And I'm like, dang, we're not supposed to have fruit. I'm so confused. And so I'm glad that you addressed that to a degree. So it sounds like when we eat fructose, it triggers this switch in us internally as humans that we're talking about, the survival switch. But also there are other things that we can eat that contain glucose that then converts to fructose in our systems and thus flip this switch for us again.
That's right.
And I am grateful that you kind of clarified that eating fruits is not bad, that you're not saying don't eat fruits.
Yeah.
So could you kind of hone in on that a little bit more? You already said a little bit about French fries and potatoes and things like that and soda. So if we're not really worried about fruits, because I think when you say fructose, people kind of immediately go to fruit, right? The sugar from fruit.
Right.
So maybe help our listeners understand a little bit the difference between fructose and glucose and how they operate in the body. And then what really should we be watching out for when it comes to consuming things that are going to flip this switch for us internally?
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, the classic, there's two main carbohydrates that are fructose and glucose, the simple sugars. And glucose is the sugar in our blood that we use as our main fuel system. And glucose, when it's low, we call it hypoglycemia, and you get lightheaded because you don't have enough glucose around and your mind doesn't function that well, and you can get lightheaded and confused. And if your glucose goes too high, we call it diabetes. And so we try to maintain that glucose in a normal level. And glucose is in sugar and high fructose corn syrup, but so is fructose. So fructose, on the other hand, is really the sugar that's driving fat. Glucose is really for immediate energy. Fructose turns out to be more for storing energy. And that's how animals use it. Now,
is there a big difference?
They're very similar. They are chemically different, and they have different reactions. They have different enzymes, but they both are 6-carbon sugars. They have the same molecular weight.
Gotcha.
But anyway, I will say that with glucose, there has been a very big theory that's gone on for years that says that glucose is what's responsible for driving obesity. And there's the whole concept of the low carb diet has been to try to reduce the amount of glucose you eat. And that's like starchy foods, because like when you eat rice or potatoes that have a lot of glucose in them, when you eat them, the blood glucose will tend to go up right after the meal. And there's a name for it. We call them high glycemic carbs. So when you eat bread, for example, let's say your glucose level's normally 90, after you eat a big, couple slices or 3 slices of bread or whatever you're eating.
That monster sandwich you had for lunch.
That monster is fun, right?
Yeah.
The big bagel, that really dense bagel.
Good
that
smear on it.
The muffin. Yeah, so when you eat those things, the blood sugar can go up to like 130 or 140. And a lot of people are buying these things called continuous glucose monitors, where they can actually measure their own response to eating these carbs. And the theory is that when the glucose goes up to like 140, insulin gets released, and insulin moves the glucose into the tissues where it gets converted to fat. And this is called the carb insulin hypothesis. And it's based on this that people go on low carb diets, and when they do that, they lose weight, and they try to keep that glucose excursion from going high. And we've done very fancy experiments in animals, and we can confirm that there is a carb insulin pathway that drives some obesity. So some of the obesity from carbs really is through the insulin storing fat. It seems to be real. However, it turns out that when the glucose levels go up in the blood, that also is the signal to convert to fructose. And in lab animals, we can actually block the fructose. We have genetically modified animals that can't metabolize fructose. And we can show that the way high glycemic carbs work is that at least half of the effect is from fructose and half of the effect is from the insulin pathway. And when it comes to things like insulin resistance and so forth, it's mainly the fructose that's driving that. So the bottom line is when you go on a low carb diet, the reason it works so well for losing weight, it really is a fantastic system for losing weight. The low carb diet reduces the glycemic carbs as well as sugar. They're all carbs. Fructose is a carb, so it reduces your intake of these carbs that contain fructose, but it also reduces these high glycemic carbs that make fructose. And then, even on a really like a keto diet, you can eat all the salt you want, because the way salt works is it converts the glucose to fructose. But if you don't have a lot of glucose present because you're on a keto diet, then the salt's kind of like an empty gun.
Not a lot to convert at that point.
Yes. So anyway, so now I do want to get back to the comment from Derek about water, because as a kidney specialist, I was always taught that it was a myth that drinking 8 glasses of water a day can help you lose weight. And so when we discovered that there was this that high salt diets could cause weight gain, and we actually showed it in animals, and we found it in people too, that most people are overweight or eating not just a lot of sugar, but a lot of salt. And so a high salt diet actually predicts obesity just like a high sugar diet does. And so once we knew that salt could actually drive obesity, the question was, could drinking water block obesity? And when you see all these young people with their big water bottles and they're running all around, and they're always skinny, right? They're always skinny. And then you say to yourself, now, is this just a myth or is it real? And so what we did an experiment. This was done by my friend Mehmet Canby in Istanbul. So this study was done in Istanbul. But you can make soups. I don't know, you get these creamy soups. You can add salt and make them quite salty to a level where people don't really recognize how much salt is in there. So what we did is we made a pretty salty soup. And we knew that the salt was high enough to activate the fructose production and this whole kind of switch, right? And we actually had identified some blood tests that we could measure that would show us that the switch was being activated even at 10 minutes, 15 minutes.
Wow.
So what we did is we gave the soup to people, and we found that we could activate the switch, and their blood pressure shot up and everything. It's transient, okay? So we weren't doing anything unethical, and everybody's eating salty food. Every time you go eat popcorn, it's the same thing. So you're activating this switch. So now, to a second group, they got to get the salty soup, but they had to drink some water with it. And we had 3 groups where one group drank a small amount of water and one group drank a lot of water. And we could show that if they drank water with the soup, they would not activate the switch.
Wow.
So drinking water. And then we did a study in animals where we put animals on sugar, and they get really fat after several months. And we started them on where we gave them food where we injected water in the food, so the food had water high water content, and so they ate this. They would eat the same amount of food, but they were getting a lot more water. And what happened was we were able to reverse slow obesity, reverse insulin resistance, and we published it in a top journal. Basically, water intake can block the development of obesity. So these people who are drinking all that water,
They've got the right idea. They're
They
doing
got
the
the
right
right
thing
idea.
all this time. Drink your water,
Yeah.
kids. Just like mom said when we were growing up. Don't have the juice, have the water. It's the same thing
Yeah,
I tell to my kids.
eight glasses a day is a really good one. You want to drink enough water where the urine is, if you look at your urine, it's maybe very, very pale, not completely clear like water. You want just a slight tinge of color, because it is, but if it's dark yellow, you need to drink more. Interestingly, it is possible to drink too much water. It's called water intoxication. And if you drink gallons and gallons of water, you can outdo your ability to excrete the water, and you can get into trouble. So I really recommend, in general, this concept of about 8 glasses a day. That's about the right amount.
We talking 8-ounce glasses, 12-ounce glasses?
So the classic is 8-ounce glasses or 6 12-ounce glasses. But if you're working outside in the hot heat, you may want to try to drink a little bit more, but you can use that rule of looking at the color of your urine. Now, there's 3 exceptions. If you're running marathons, you got to be a little careful, because you can be, when you're running a marathon, it's been shown that you can become very sensitive to water. And so if you're running a marathon or any kind of chronic long distance type of thing, you only want to drink to thirst. Now, I think I understand what's causing that, and I have a paper in press, and I believe it's because people get behind in their hydration, and then they drink some sugary fluids that cause an activation of a hormone that can drive this thing. So I do think it's may have a fructose basis, but at this point in time, if you're running a marathon, just drink to thirst. And secondly, the second group that has to be careful is that anytime you have surgery, that first 24 hours following surgery, you tend to hold on to water. And if you have heart or kidney or liver disease, you may also have to be careful. And so talk to your physician about how much water you can drink. But almost everybody can drink, 8 glasses a day seems to be a pretty good starting point.
Well, when you just mentioned the heart, it kind of made me think of something I was thinking earlier when you were talking about the uric acid and, these crystals, and then we started talking about heart disease. And it's just interesting to me because I think most people that think about heart disease, it's kind of been hammered home for a really long time that fat and fat intake really contributes to heart disease. But it sounds like what you're saying is that actually sugar intake, fructose, could actually be a contributing factor to heart disease.
Yes. So now we're getting into a new area, which is really exciting. And currently there is the science suggests that the things that cause heart disease are family history, very high cholesterol levels, smoking. These are like well characterized risk factors. And the cholesterol story, is based on the fact that, drugs like statins can reduce the risk for heart disease, and they lower cholesterol. And because the plaques seem to be cholesterol rich. So it all sort of makes sense. Now, there's been challenges to the cholesterol theory in the last few years. But I think for now, at least, I don't really want to dive into that too much, but cholesterol is still viewed as a pretty significant risk factor. However, what's really happened that's new, and which brings the fructose and uric acid story right in there, is the discovery by Paul Ritker, a Boston cardiologist at Harvard, who did these beautiful studies that have documented that inflammation is also a risk factor for heart disease. And what do I mean by inflammation? Well, you can measure, various things in the blood to determine if your body shows evidence of low-grade inflammation. So inflammation is, like classic inflammation is like if you have a fever and your white count is high, but there can be low grade inflammation where the white count's not so high, your temperature may be normal, but your blood shows markers that suggest that the white cells are activated and there's some kind of activation of your immune system. And the classic test is a thing called CRP, or C-reactive protein. And many people get this test done to determine if they're at increased risk for heart disease, because it's now recognized that low-grade systemic inflammation is a major risk factor for heart disease. So, there's all these studies trying to block the inflammation, but a more important question is, what is the cause of the inflammation?
That's what I was going to say.
And when when we talk to the experts, they don't really know. But what's happened is it's been discovered that uric acid is pro-inflammatory in the body, and even when it's not in a crystal form. And when your serum uric acid is high, you actually often show this inflammation in your blood. And if you lower the uric acid, the inflammation commonly improves. And now we've got these crystals of uric acid that are occurring in the plaque, and we have genetic studies and epidemiologic studies linking uric acid with heart attacks and sudden heart death. And there's quite a few papers that suggest that lowering uric acid may provide cardiovascular benefit, reductions in heart disease. And so it's really a very interesting area. There's it's still, a area of controversy. But I would say that the data is pretty overwhelming that uric acid and fructose are very likely involved in the inflammation that drives heart disease. And so that's another thing against the fructose story. The fructose story, another reason you don't want to eat a lot of fructose, because not only is it driving inflammation, or high blood pressure and obesity and diabetes, but it's also driving inflammation. And in fact, just in the last about a month ago, we published a big paper showing that this fructose pathway probably has a big role in the disease Alzheimer's. And
Wow.
this has received a lot of attention. Alzheimer's disease is one of the most crippling, devastating diseases that exists.
Really heartbreaking.
It is heartbreaking. You're exactly right. It's the sixth most common cause of death, and it's increasing because people are getting older, so they're more susceptible to getting dementia. But it also seems to be increasing even within a set age group. So it seems like the disease is on the increase. And it's a disease that there's no really effective therapies. There are a few therapies that have come out, but really nothing works. So it's like no one wants to. That's like the disease that's least wanted.
Well, it's not just like a death sentence. It's also a death sentence without holding on to any kind of joy in your final days, months, years. I can't imagine.
And it's horrible for the families too, because they see people that were once completely with it, and now they can't communicate to them. So it's a devastating disease. So when Alzheimer, who was a physician scientist, when he first described the disease back in 1906, he actually characterized it as kind of a shrinkage of the brain. The brain actually shrinks. It's terrible. It's called atrophy. So the brain shrinks. And then not only does it shrink, but when you look in the tissues, you see these what they call amyloid plaques of protein that are called amyloid-like proteins. And then there's also these things that he called neurofibrillary tangles, but basically it's the neurons get these proteins that aggregate inside of them called tau proteins. And so the disease was thought to be a disease based upon amyloid and tau protein. And so for the last 30 years, 40 years, people have been trying to figure out how to block the amyloid protein from forming in the tau protein, and the disease is thought to be due to those two things. And there have been over 20 different drugs that went to market to try to block these, and all the trials failed except for the borderline effects of a recent trial that led to the use of that drug, but it's really kind of borderline benefit. So then people say, well, okay, well, if it's not the amyloid and it's not the tau protein, maybe it's something that starts earlier, and maybe these are the consequence of the disease rather than the cause of the disease.
Interesting question shift.
Yeah. So then what they did is say, okay, so what are the earlier changes? And they found 3 characteristic findings. The first one was that they found that it was a low energy state, that the brain reduces its ATP, and that's associated with suppression of the mitochondria. And guess what? That's exactly what fructose does.
Wow.
That's how fructose works. The second thing they found was that it causes insulin resistance in the brain. And although, some parts of the brain don't require insulin, a lot of the brain does. And it becomes resistant to insulin. And guess what? That's what fructose does. And then the third thing is they found low-grade inflammation, which is exactly what fructose does.
Wow.
So now people are like, for the insulin resistance, they're giving intranasal insulin as trials, and they're trying to figure out ways to improve the mitochondria. But again, it's like putting a Band-Aid on the problem. What we want to know is what's causing the insulin resistance, what's causing the low ATP. So it turns out that the dietary foods that are associated with the Alzheimer's include, guess what? High sugar diets, high glycemic diets, high salt diets.
Oh, man.
The exact same ones that either produce or that generate fructose. The same ones, okay? It's associated with obesity and diabetes, which are conditions which we know are being driven by fructose. So that fits. And then we start looking and we give fructose to animals, and they find that after about 4 months, they can't go through a maze very effectively. They can't learn how to go through it. Normally a mouse or a rat, you can put them on a maze, and every time they go through it, they get through a little faster.
Right.
Not if you give them sugar. And then they looked in the brains of the mice and rats that were getting sugar, and guess what they found? They found high fructose levels. They found the reduction in ATP in the mitochondria, in the cells. They found the insulin resistance. They found the inflammation. And then if they took the animals out long enough, they found the tau protein and the amyloid. It was all there.
Wow.
Then they looked at people. They looked at people with Alzheimer's who died, and they looked in their brains, and they found high levels of fructose in the brain, 5-fold higher.
Wow.
And so I think that the evidence is really, really strong that fructose is the cause of Alzheimer's disease, and that you can reduce the risk for Alzheimer's by trying to reduce sugar, not eat so much carbs. Now, I'm not telling you can never eat bread or cake, but I'm just telling you what we should. Thank God. I'm just saying what we want to do is we want to try to reduce our intake of foods that we know may not be so good for you, and drink more water. Don't use as much salt. I write a lot about this in my book, Nature Wants Us to Be Fat, and other little tricks like taking vitamin C. These things can help.
It's becoming clear to me why your focus of study shifted. As you're talking about this and as I'm learning about it, I'm just like, this is just wild, seeing how it's all tying in and how much of an answer this could be to a lot of health issues that we all face. So I think it's really, really interesting.
Yeah. So I'll tell you that when I started studying Alzheimer's, I knew that I needed to find experts, and I found David Perlmutter, who's a fantastic, he's a neurologist. He wrote The Grain Brain. He's a brilliant man. He wrote about uric acid, and it's my friend, and I got him involved. Dale Bredesen, another very famous author who's been using diet to try to treat Alzheimer's, and also Maria Nagel, who's this a very brilliant researcher on Alzheimer's. So the trick is, when you go into an area that you're not an expert on, you find experts around you, and you work with them. I will tell you one little story that's kind of the coup de grace for this Alzheimer's story. And that is, the question is, why would fructose want to cause dementia?
Yeah.
So there's always seems to be some like evolutionary base. So there, the question is maybe there's something good here, and that was meant to be good at least. And remember, I told you that when you give fructose to an animal, they start foraging for food. When you give sugar to a kid, they get hyperactive and kind of run around. And
Can confirm. I have two of
yeah.
those at home.
So the question is, what is this? And it turns out that it's a foraging response. And what it is when you want to forage, you have to develop exploratory behavior. You have to increase your locomotor activity. You kind of running around looking for things. You can't focus on anything for a long time. You have to be able to assess the environment, get to the next place, because you're at risk for predators. It's dangerous. So you have to be brave. You see that cave and you think there's food in it. You may have to go in there, but there may be a predator in there, but and so in order to do all these things, you have to reduce your self-control. You have to induce more exploratory behavior. You want to reduce you want to have less attention, less deliberation and more quick decision-making. And so it turns out that the brain is really sophisticated, and there are areas of the brain that are involved in self-control and reasoning. There are other parts of the brain that are involved in memory and so forth. And there's certain regions of the brain that drive foraging. And it turns out that the areas that drive foraging, if you take fructose, those areas light up with increased blood flow. And like the visual cortex, so that you can find that food, particularly for food cues, that lights up when you eat fructose. So that, they can do these things called bold MRI to look at the brain patterns in people. And interesting, like the cerebral cortex, which is involved in self-control, you give fructose, the blood flow there drops, and it turns out to be the insulin-dependent areas, right?
Oh, wow.
And when the hippocampus, which drives recent memory, the blood flow drops there because you don't really want to have that vivid of memory. So it turns out that fructose inhibits certain regions of the brain and activates others. And what's incredibly interesting about Alzheimer's is that the areas that are associated with stimulation of foraging are preserved. They're not affected in Alzheimer's, or they're affected late. Whereas the areas in the brain that are affected are the areas exactly where fructose inhibits. So and glucose does the opposite. When you give glucose acutely, it actually does the opposite. So it looks to me like what happened was this was meant to be a foraging response. But when you repeatedly, and we're eating so much sugar and high fructose corn syrup,
it's in everything.
We're continuously reducing blood supply, dropping the ATP, and eventually the system kind of caves, and the neurons start to die. They can't, they don't recover, and so I think that there's this thing in Alzheimer's. You've probably heard of it, the wandering response. 8 out of 10 people with Alzheimer's, unfortunately, will have this thing where they can just wander off, and it's kind of scary because you don't know where they'll go, and they don't know where they're going, and it can be terrifying for everybody.
So I used to work at a senior living care facility.
There you go.
And we actually had a lady who walked out the front door at about midnight and made it all the way down to the fire station down the road, and we had to go and get her.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, it was a pretty scary.
When I was a resident, we had these patients with Alzheimer's. We one guy would wander off all the time. We put a sign on his back that says, "Return me to 3 north."
Oh my
yeah,
goodness.
exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Just in case.
Dr. Johnson, it sounds like you're building this case that fructose can have a massive impact on Alzheimer's, but it almost sounds like it can also have a similar impact, probably on younger minds as well, for ADHD, and maybe and probably why we're seeing such a huge prevalence of attention deficit mental disorders recently.
Derek, you're exactly right. We've actually written about it. We've got several papers on it. There was this period of time where people were trying to debunk sugar as a cause of ADHD, and we go into the reasons why those studies. There were some studies that were negative, but there have been recent studies that really link it, and the biochemistry is very similar. Patients with, and also this disorder called bipolar disorder. And there's a very strong link with fructose and uric acid. I go into it in my book, and I've also written about it in the medical literature. But the incredible thing, Derek, the incredible thing about this story is that it's so important. And so that's why I wrote the book when we realized it was that we kind of stumbled on a big story. It just seems so important to get it out, and then to point out the foods that are good. There are some foods that actually counter it. For example, dark chocolate has a substance in it called epicatechin that actually neutralizes some of the effects.
Wow.
Vitamin C is actually protected to some extent. So is vitamin B1 or thiamine. They both increase energy in the cells, block oxidative stress of the mitochondria. So there's all these things you read about. That we can eat that are good, and at the same time, there's a lot of things that are bad. And our tastes actually are generated to probably pick out these foods. But once you know how to, what the situation is, it's much easier to kind of help yourself in terms of figuring out what the best diets are and so forth.
Yeah. So you're touching on a couple of different chemical compounds. So the one that's in dark chocolate and then
Yeah.
vitamin C and those kind of things. A lot of our audience are very interested in supplements and wanting to know,
Yeah.
like, what can they do and what can they take to be able to do that. I know that like berberine and metformin both can have massive impacts on blood sugar. Can you speak and give us your opinion about those?
Yes. So I actually Melanie Avalon, who has a podcast, has been promoting berberine, and she actually sent me some. And I have a continuous glucose monitor because I'm very curious what foods drive my glucose up. And I can confirm, many of my patients have also taken berberine, but I can confirm that berberine really is probably an insulin sensitizer. The literature shows it, and I can now say personally, I've seen it. I think it does improve your glucose levels from going up too high. And metformin is a great drug in many ways. If very high levels may not be so good, but or if you have kidney disease, but it appears to be good. Interestingly, it interferes, it blocks a component of the fructose pathway. And it was published by one group, and we confirmed it. So it's like a weak inhibitor, but we think that that's why it's so beneficial, because it actually interferes with the pathway. Dark chocolate is another one. It was kind of discovered by a friend of mine, Norm Hollenberg, was doing these studies on these Indians or these Native Americans called Kuna, and they live on the San Blas Islands off the coast of Panama. And he had heard that these guys never get obesity and diabetes. So he went down there trying to figure out what gene they had, because he was assuming everything was genetic. But it turned out that when these Kuna moved to Panama City, they became fat very quickly. So it was something about their diet. And he had a dietitian in his group who was very smart, and she figured out that the Kuna were drinking very large amounts of bitter cocoa. They were drinking like 10, 15 cups a day.
Wow.
And so they did studies on the bitter cocoa. Yeah. And they found that it contained this substance called epicatechin. And you can get it from dark chocolate. So milk chocolate inactivates it, but dark chocolate usually still has it in it. And
is there a certain percentage that it needs to be? Does it need to be like 90? Because I know there's ranges.
Yeah, so I have a friend who started a company to try to make epicatechin and he's had these wonderful trial results in like muscular dystrophy and things like that. So it's really a great compound. And he tells me that you do not have to eat 90%, that you can get adequate amounts from 70%. And what you do is you buy one of those big bars like that, and you just eat one row, so like one a day of just one part of that candy bar.
Wow, that little bit is enough to make a difference.
Yes, he believes so. I haven't tested it in animals myself, but he actually did a study where he gave it to people with heart failure, for example, and found that he could improve their ability to walk around a block shorter time and longer distance. He also as I said, gave the purified form to patients, children with muscular dystrophy, a certain type, and he was able to improve their mitochondria, and they could make more energy. And we did a study in people with metabolic syndrome where we gave epicatechin, and we could improve various aspects of the epicatechin with just a single dose. So
That's amazing.
so I think it's a good drug.
There's another one that has been getting a lot of interest online lately, and I'm sure you've heard of it. Semaglutide, GLP-1 agonists.
Yes.
I know that yerba mate actually contains a chemical that can increase the production of GLP-1 in the body. But what's your take on semaglutide?
Well, it does work. It's expensive. People are making a lot of money on it.
It's hard to get.
It's hard to get, but expensive, but it does work. It has a lot of side effects, bloating, burping, and so a part of the reason it works is that it doesn't make you feel so good. But that's like in maybe 10 or 15%. But a lot of people are using it now. Rob Lustig, who's a friend of mine, has pointed out that the amount of cost, that it costs to take this in a year, that you could, and if you could do the same thing with a keto diet or a low carb diet, So the question is it really a good long-term solution? The other problem is when you stop it, the weight gain comes right back.
Yeah.
So I think it would be better if we could find other solutions, but it's certainly for some people it would be life-saving.
Yeah.
And it can probably prevent bariatric surgery in some. And so I think it really has a place, but I'm not sure that everybody should be taking it. I'd rather have people kind of figure out what, and try to just modify diet as a mechanism. In my book, I actually talk about it. Now, if you're addicted to sugar and so forth, which some people are, maybe this would be a useful thing.
Right. For someone that feels like they've tried everything they can and they're still just struggling with their weight, still trying to find any kind of measure of health, having mechanisms like this to help starting going in the right direction can, like you said, sometimes be life-saving.
I think so. Yeah. I agree with that.
I'm going to read your book now, first of all, because just this conversation alone, I feel is like opened up more ideas about things that I've personally thought about a lot over the years and different ways of eating that I've tried and just kind of understanding what's going on in the body. And I thought that I already knew a pretty good amount, but I've got to say today, you've proven me wrong. There was obviously still quite a lot for me to learn about how glucose and fructose are working inside my body and the mechanisms, the switch that gets flipped when that's happening. And so just with what I've learned today, there's things that I'm going to be changing in what I'm doing and even some supplements that I'm going to make sure. And I'm not a huge dark chocolate fan, I'll be honest. I'm honestly not much of a sweets fan. Carbs, potatoes, those, bread, I'm in for it. Sweets, not so much, but you know what?
Salt and vinegar potato chips.
Oh,
That's
you
right.
heard me. But you know what? Now I'm going to try to always keep some dark chocolate in my pantry and just like, why not make sure that I have a strip of that every day? If that seems like such a simple thing that I can do to make an impact on the way fructose is operating inside of my body.
I also have so much more to learn too. We're constantly doing more studies to try to better understand these pathways. But I will say, one great thing that everyone can do if you guys want to try to just do something super simple.
Yes, tell us. We're all listening.
Honestly, just try this for me. Drink a glass of water before each meal. Get the glass of water as part of your dinner, breakfast, lunch, and put it next to your food. And then teach yourself, make it a habit to drink the glass of water completely before you start eating. So you have one glass of water before each meal. And then try to drink one glass of water in the mid-afternoon and one glass in the mid-morning. And, and then you're halfway there. I don't really recommend drinking right before you go to bed because you're going to get
Actually, when I get really thirsty right before bed, that's usually my trigger that I haven't had enough in the day.
Well, there you go. Then you should drink. If you're thirsty, you got to drink water. But anyway, Just do the water thing. I get more emails from people going, "Oh my God, I've been trying to get rid of that last 5 pounds and I cannot do it. And then I tried this, just this simple move. Who would ever know?" And I have many emails like that. So
Well, I'm
That's
really glad you
amazing.
gave us that tip, because I think a lot of times when people are listening to someone like you who has so much knowledge and information to offer to help us have better results with our health and feel like we're doing things that are impacting it, a lot of times you can leave a conversation like this and just feel like, where do I even begin? And
yeah,
so I'm really glad that you said that, because that,
yeah,
in fact, is such a simple thing that literally
yeah,
everyone listening right now can do. They could start it right now.
yeah. And if you do get it, email me again, because I like seeing that. I like that, getting those emails, because it makes me feel like people just don't recognize the power of water and salt, and just reducing salt and is another thing you can do to help lose weight.
That's
So
amazing.
yeah,
That's amazing. Well, Dr.
yeah.
Johnson, it's been a absolute pleasure having you on. You've been a wealth of knowledge. Where can people find you and your work?
So I do have a website. It's drrichardjohnson.com, and that's where I try to put most of my, um, things like papers, and sometimes I write little things and podcasts. So the website's a great place to find me. My book, Nature Wants Us to Be Fat, really summarizes the vast majority of what we've discovered, and it provides diets and things. So you can get that at any bookstore, Amazon, all those kinds of things. I do have a Twitter, Dr. Richard J. Johnson, and I have I'm sorry, that's my Instagram. Sorry.
Okay.
My Twitter is Richard J. Johns, JOHNS 11, or I guess it's at Richard J. Johnson 11. Sorry.
Perfect.
Sorry.
Awesome. Well, like I
Okay.
said, it's been absolutely wonderful to have you on, and
It has.
we'd love to be able to talk to you again at some point in the
Yes.
future.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
so much for making the
Thank-
time. I'm just so excited for everyone to hear this and to take all the things that you've talked about and have a better impact on their overall health and their lifestyles. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Yeah, you're welcome.